Welcome everybody to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Beiser, and we have another developer interview lined up for our episode. My guest is from Mimimi Games. This is the company that, over the past decade, has brought back the idea of the stealth strategy game with titles like Shadow Tactics and Desperados 3, and they're currently working on their next take, Shadow Gambit. So please welcome to the cast, Moritz Wagner. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. It is a pleasure having you on, and thanks again for being interested in coming on. I'm always happy to talk with new developers, and I've been really wanting to talk with you guys since being able to play Shadow Tactics.
Yeah, nice. It's good to be here, and let's dive in.
So, for people watching this live or if you're watching this recorded, if you have any questions for Moritz about Mimimi Games, be sure to let us know either in the comments or in the chat on the right. So, since this is your first time on the cast, I always like to give developers a chance to kind of introduce themselves, what is your background, and of course, for people who may not have heard of Shadow Tactics or your company, like a brief overview of what your games are about.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm Mo. I'm the head of design at Mimimi. So I do a lot of game design and coordinating designers and stuff like that. And I used to do level design as well and build content when we were still smaller, but for this project right now, I'm not doing that much anymore. And yeah, Mimimi was founded in, I think 2010 or 11. I'm not quite sure. In the beginning, we actually studied together. So we studied game design together, and then we founded the company about 10 years ago. And yeah, we've been doing sorts of other stuff in the beginning. There was an action 3D third-person action adventure game, and then a couple of mobile things. And then we made Shadow Tactics, which is basically the type of game we're known for now. And it's a stealth strategy game, and that sort of got us kicked off, and it was a bigger success. So it was a good direction for us, and we stayed with that. And we're about 35 people now. It's steadily but slowly growing. Like Shadow Tactics was still 15, and Desperados was 20-25. Now it's 30-35. So it's slow growth.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a second ago about kind of like the first game from the studio was like a 3D platformer, and then of course you went on to do Shadow Tactics. And I guess what attracted like you in the studio to making a Shadow Tactics? As kind of like this was like the game that became again your breakout title for the studio.
Yeah, so when we were still studying, first we have to go back, I guess, a little bit to when we were younger. At least some of us from the core team. We played a lot of Commandos and Desperados. That's when I was 12 or 13. I think these games came out about that time. The same for our creative director Dom, and these games were huge in Germany. They were big in other parts of the world, but they were huge in Germany, so we played a lot of them. And this is basically the original, like Commandos is the original stealth strategy game, right? And it was one of our favorite games, and it was actually during our studies when we were studying game design that Dominic was the creative director. Now, back then, we were students. He was. Like we were talking about stuff, and I was doing sort of rap videos at that time, like sort of online video rap battle stuff. That was rather fun, and it was ninja themed. I was doing stuff with ninjas. It's rather goofy, but it was fun. And we were just talking, and then he was like, "Yeah, well, ninjas, blah blah," talking about that, and oh yeah, Commandos, our favorite game, and then it was like, why is there we should make Commandos with ninjas? Like that's the perfect fit. Like have us every game in this genre so far up to Shadow Tactics has not been very stealthy from the setting. Like it's World War II, which the Commandos themselves, they are doing ops basically, and so they are sort of stealthy, but it's still a World War theme, right? And then we have Cowboys in Desperados, which is not stealthy at all from the basic setup. And we decided, well, ninjas is the pop culture stealth thing. So that's how we got the idea, and that was during our studies. It was just always bounced around and nothing ever came of it. And we made the third-person action adventure platformer thing, The Last Tinker, that's what it's called. We did the mobile games, and then after that, we sort of started doing pitches. And back then, mobile was still like, I want to say still huge. It was tiny compared to what it is now, but it was still something where, as a smaller studio, you could actually make a game and people would see it. So mobile, like the iPad was coming up and stuff like that. So we were into that type of stuff, and we were pitching Shadow Tactics as a mobile game back then, actually, like for the iPads, or maybe something like Commandos with ninjas on a mobile devices, because that's what we were doing at the time. Aside from the big platformer, we were doing a lot of mobile stuff. And yeah, then the pitch came up, and then we talked to the Delic, who published it eventually. We knew them from our previous games. We met them at award shows, stuff like that. So we were like friends with them. And yeah, they had a little bit of cash coming in because they just got sold partially, I think. And they decided to publish our game. And we made it PC consoles, and that's how Shadow Tactics basically was born.
Yep, and as you were saying, with like the Commandos and that kind of stuff, like, I remember that was huge in the '90s, and it was one of those genres, just like I feel the other ones that we've seen, that kind of like the adventure genre, where it kind of disappeared from the AAA side, and the independent space really took up more with the adventure games. And with this kind of like stealth strategy, I guess like looking at like Shadow Tactics, Mimimi definitely did a lot to kind of, I guess, like re-engineer it for modern audiences when it was released. So my next question for you is like, when you and the team were kind of trying to figure out how you wanted to re-engineer this in the 2010s, what aspects did you want to include, and what did you kind of see was like any kind of like stumbling blocks or issues that you wanted to avoid with the game?
Okay, so something that we wanted to aim for at the core was what we like think, and also back then thought. I mean, this type of stuff, you develop an even better understanding the more you work on these types of things, of course. So maybe I'm going to say something different than I would have said 10 years ago. But what we were seeing as one of the big positives is it's very fun to solve these puzzles. Basically, the way they are set up with the vision cones, and it's a very simple design. Like, there is not much going on. At least in the first Commandos, they sort of lost that later on, and this is something we're gonna get to when I'm talking about the stuff we didn't want to keep. But it's very clean. Like, you have the vision cone and you have noise. You have almost perfect information. There is no fog of war. There is no, like in a third-person stealth game, as most games are, you don't have sort of which is a great thing for these stealth games, the who's behind the next corner. But it's hard to keep an overview of where guards are. You can't really track them, right? Unless you do something like Triple Eight did with marking them, and you can see them through walls and stuff like that. But this problem didn't really exist for Commandos because it's a top-down game. You have a lot of overview and you have a lot of information. And we wanted to keep that. We wanted to keep and also expand on the uniqueness of the characters. That is very important, that every character is a specialist. Like in these types of games, you play as a small group of specialists, up to 5 usually. And they have very distinct skill sets. And combining these is what makes the game fun, and solving the puzzles within it. And we wanted to expand on that and keep that part alive, but also improve it, because we saw a lot of way to improve there. Then, of course, like some of the basic stuff that we wanted to improve on is like controls, stuff like that. It's just a very old game, and these usually don't hold up as well, obviously, because a lot of stuff has been developed since they were developed. And so this is something we wanted to improve on. And we also wanted to, like, they were very hard. That is something that was important to us. Like, we wanted to keep that alive, but we made it a little easier, and it's something we've been doing a lot more because we wanted to make it more accessible so more people can enjoy it without losing the hard part. If you put it to a hard difficulty, you can still play in hard. And then there was one, I think, one of the core issues that we have with Commandos was, while the characters were great, first of all, there's no real story to speak of. That's something that we definitely wanted to improve on. Desperados already did that. Like, Desperados, when it came out, basically was Commandos with story and cowboys, and that was a big improvement. So we wanted to take that, of course. But the character, as I mentioned previously, the balance of the characters, the uniqueness of the characters, they were unique and distinct, but they were not great. There were some that are really good, and there were some that were rather useless. We had this sort of, it even became a term for us when we were designing it even is sort of the driver. The driver in Commandos is not a very well designed character. Like, he has no skills to speak of. He can use guns, but who wants to use guns in a stealth game? So he's sort of, and he can drive vehicles, which in theory sounds great, but there are basically no vehicles in the game because it's a stealth game. You're not driving around, you're just sitting there. So the only thing you do with the driver is that you put him somewhere, and then you complete the whole mission, and then in the end, it's usually drive away with the tank or the car or whatever, and then you pick up the driver, move him through an empty map full of dead enemies, put him into the car, and drive off with your team. And that's a bad character, right? He's not like the Green Beret or the diver, the guys you use all the time, who have like great takedown abilities, a ranged kill with the harpoon of the diver, stuff like that. All of these skills, they're great. So we wanted every character to feel like that. So this was one of the biggest things that we wanted to improve on, and so we came up with a system on how to do that. And another thing that was very important for us was the maps and the missions and how these felt, and that's something we wanted to keep as well, was these huge maps with a large amount of enemies, and just playing a mission for a couple of hours. This is different in Shadow Gambit now, so there's going to be an interesting discussion maybe on how we arrived at that point. But back then, we really wanted to revive the core of the genre. Like, we wanted to give something that we wanted as fans of the genre that did not exist anymore. We didn't want to change anything. Like, we changed a lot, but nothing that made it feel different. Like, we wanted it to feel the way Commandos felt to us when we were young, to other people.
Mm-hmm. And with designing like the different roles for the characters in the Shadow Tactics, as you said, Sengo, with Commandos, there was that issue where you had like really good characters who had a lot of functionality, and then you had someone who had very little. What was kind of the philosophy behind how you wanted each character to behave? Because as you said, of course, like being with ninjas, you don't necessarily have the same tool set as you do with World War II operators.
So we actually went pretty close to the genre things that existed, right? I mean, we have Commandos and Desperados, and like all the titles they remix the same things over and over, and this is something we did as well. We looked at what they have, and the thing we basically came up with on how to make them balance and make every character fun is sort of a system where we said, okay, everybody, there are exceptions sometimes, but everybody has a normal kill. Like, we don't want characters that cannot kill anybody unless the rest of their skill set is so special and unique that it's cool if they can't do that. So this is Takuma, for example. We come to him. But this was the basic thing. Like, everybody should be able to do that. Because in Commandos, I don't even think that everybody's able to do that. And the same is for Desperados. Some people can only knock enemies out. Some can only kill them. And that doesn't add interesting decisions, in my opinion. It's just, I'm not going to use that character for this, but I like that character. And then you have to maybe reposition arbitrarily to just get someone with a kill next to the guard. And it's just not that fun. So this is the first thing we did. Then we have and this goes a lot into your actual question, is the second skill is the special skill. And the special skill is the one that defines the character. And this is basically, as the older games did as well, in a way, it's not the skill you actually use the most. That's the next one, and the one that has the biggest impact on gameplay, but it's the one that if a person describes the character to another person, this is the skill they're going to talk about. For example, for Yuki or Hector or Trapper characters, it's a trap. They can lay traps. Or we have the Hayato or Cooper, who can use throwing knives or shuriken. So they're sort of ranged character. So every character has this sort of thing that when you think of them, that's a skill you're going to think of, and that's the skill that actually makes them feel very unique because it allows them to interact with enemies and kill them in a special way. Usually, like, it's usually a kill ability, right? Aside for the spy, the distract characters like Kate and Aiko, who can use distractions and disguise themselves. For them, that's sort of the special skill that's not directly a kill. And then we have the distraction. That is also something that it is the most important skill for every character, even though it doesn't feel that way as a player, I think. But that's the skill that you use most of the time because you need to distract guards a lot in stealth games, and all the puzzles in our games are built in a way that you need to distract one or multiple guards, usually. And the distractions, how they behave, they allow you to maybe use a whistle and whistle someone out of a setup so they come to your location, which is very powerful, or you can make them look away by throwing a stone somewhere, these sorts of things. And so we decided that we want to give every character one of each. So they can all do, like, you can always use them in any situation, but there might be some that are better in that situation and others that are better in that situation. But it's never like, this guy is useless. He's a driver. He can't do anything. They can all do everything. But they excel in certain areas. And there are certain things that only they can do. For example, we have a sniper that can kill very long range. We have characters that can kill multiple enemies at once with their special attacks. So we try to make them feel special in this way. And I think that's one of the biggest improvements we made to the genre. And it's something that you don't really think about. Like, if you play Shadow Tactics, I think you're like, oh man, this is just exactly like Commandos. And then when you play Commandos again, you realize, wait, it's not exactly like it. There's stuff that has been changed.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I noticed when I played Shadow Tactics, especially going back to the original Commandos, it can be a little tricky getting used to the UI of these games. One of the things that I'm sure, like, for people watching may have bounced off or had trouble is one of the always famous things is, like, having to set up, like, figuring out where, like, the sight cone is for enemies. I know that can be a nightmare. And for Mimimi, and as you were, like, working on the UI for Shadow Tactics, I'm sure that would evolve into what we saw in Desperados and will be in Shadow Gambit. What was kind of, like, the approach, or how did you want to, like, I guess, improve or refine, like, being able to give the player, like, that kind of vision radius? Because I remember, I think it was in Shadow Tactics, you had, like, that you put down, like, a pin or you put down an icon. If anyone is looking at that, you see their actual vision cone.
Yeah, they had that in Desperados already, so we looked at the old games basically and took everything that was good, of course. And they had that. I don't know if they had in Commandos 1 already. I think so. Like, this was something they had in the old games. So we, of course, use it as well. We added some stuff that you can add it to a moving character, or that might even have existed in Desperados. I'm not quite sure. So if the character moves, you can see who sees them while they're moving through it. And overall, it was just like, the basic idea we had for the UI was it needs to be as clear and readable as possible. So we tried to keep it. I mean, I think that's true for most UIs, but for us, it was very important that you can always see stuff and you can always read the ranges that are, because we display quite a few ranges. There's noise ranges, there's skill ability ranges, there's maybe some abilities have 2 noise ranges. So there's just different stuff going on when you're using it. So we wanted to keep that very clean so you can always identify it. And then we have the vision cones, of course, who are something where, of course, a lot of work went into, especially in the beginning in Shadow Tactics. We thought about, can we, like, improve the visuals? Like, the art team, of course, wanted to improve the visuals of it because they're not very pretty, right? They're very functional. So we did a lot of iterations there. Like, can we add sort of elements to it, make it like ornaments at the around it or stuff like that. But we, in the end, decided against all that because it just made it harder to read and harder to parse, and readability and gameplay is very important to us, that it's clear. So we did smaller stuff there, but this is something that we figured for Shadow Tactics, and of course we might revisit it at some point in smaller parts, but it's like we have figured that out now, so we're not touching that anymore that much. Aside from that, then, yeah, I mean, the whole HUD, we wanted to go for, in Shadow Tactics, at least for this old school RPG, RTS vibe. It's all very haptic, like, that's the right word. It's it looks like it's a thing, like it's not abstract, like many modern UIs or AAA UIs usually are. It's old school, right? It's how games used to be back then. They had these, like, StarCraft and stuff like that. The console, it's actual flesh if you're playing Zerg, stuff like that. And so we wanted this vibe to have it be old school, highly detailed, for Shadow Tactics, to also call back to these older games and this old type of game that existed. But that's more of the visual style. It's not about UX. It's more about UI.
Yep. And it does give it, like, that very unique, like, aesthetic. Again, like, as you were saying, stuff like StarCraft, like, anyone who played a strategy game in the past, like, 30 years remembers, like, some of, like, the better examples where the UI actually, like, matches the theme or the tone of a faction or side you're playing as. Yeah,
and it like, we experimented with it. We tried to do modern styles. We tried to do styles that were like that, and the art team pushed a lot for that style, and I'm glad they did, because I think it looks very great in Shadow Tactics. And like, it is, I still like it, of course. Like, I think that I like the aesthetic, but I think it's something that for many people is very old school, and it's not very functional. There is a lot of noise in the UI, or a lot of unneeded things, because there's just graphics in the UI, right? And you could have it very clean and just focus on the usability more. So that's something that happened a little bit with Desperados then, and it keeps happening. It's just us trying to iterate on that. But a lot of it is also about, in newer games that don't look like that from a UI standpoint, we don't want the old school aesthetic anymore as much. Like for Shadow Tactics, that was sort of the selling point, right? It's what we're bringing back Commandos. Like that was it. And so we wanted to appeal to people who liked these games back then. That was our primary audience. And now we're trying to appeal to a lot more people, and we don't want to be, that's the old school game that's copying these old games, right? No, we want to be our own thing, and we want to be, and we are, I think, but that's sort of something you do to then adapt and be like, no, this is modern now. This is not, you don't have to be 30 plus to enjoy this, basically.
Let's see, a question came in from Snowman's. They asked, I'm thinking of making a top-down isometric stealth game. What do you think is the most important thing in a game like that?
There are a lot of very important things, and I think it depends on what direction you want to take it in, and what's important to you when making the game. What's important to me and to us is that it's very clearly readable and very clean, and that you always know what's going on, and that it's very responsive. That is something, like, there have been other games that came out in the same genre after we made Shadow Tactics, a few of them, and I think that's something, and that for me as well is a distinction between Commandos and Desperados, for example, that I can touch on now. We are like our games to be responsive. Like when you make an input, it instantly recognizes the input, the animations, everything is very much built around feeling great for quick strategic type of gameplay or tactical type of gameplay. It's not about realism for us. So I would make that, if we were looking at RTS games, for example, I would make the difference between the Blizzard RTS games and stuff like Edge of Empires in between, but Company of Heroes, stuff like that. Like these games where it's you order a unit somewhere and then it's slow, right? They just, and then they start moving. And in Blizzard, it's like it's completely fast paced, instant feedback, instant stuff like that. We enjoy that type of stuff. You can do both. I think it works for both. So that is something that's very important to me. I mean, it's a very weird answer, but it's a game feel thing, but I think that's a reason why our games are rather successful, given we are in a niche still, but because they feel good to play. And yeah, I don't know if it's not the most important thing. It's just something that comes to mind for me, and it's something that many games, especially smaller games, indie games, struggle with, I think. Like the animation stuff, like it just feels a little sluggish. And that takes a lot of the fun out of it for me, even though I enjoy the cerebral part of thinking about the puzzles and all that stuff. I'm just like, why is the character so slow? And then, if I turn around, this type of stuff. And not to speak bad about any of these games. This type of stuff is extremely hard to do. Like, it takes a lot of time and polish to do it. It's just something that is very important to us, so we did it. And Commandos had that as well. Commandos had a lot of animation canceling, where you could just cancel animations by doing stuff. Probably because they couldn't make enough animations back then. I think they would have wanted to make it feel more realistic, but they just couldn't. And Desperados is a lot more slower in that regard, and so we prefer how Commandos feels a lot to how Desperados feels, for example.
All right. And just one question I want to ask you about regarding like trying to, I guess, balance the difficulty of Shadow Tactics and again going to Desperados and so on. Is the idea of like having like the different challenges. I know this can be a nightmare for some people, especially if you're trying to do it all on your first go. And I remember in Shadow Tactics, you had, of course, like your kind of like quote unquote like standard bonus objectives. You know, get through the map without being seen, get through the map without killing an enemy. How, I guess, like did you and your team want to approach like the advanced side of things? Because as you said, like you're trying to appeal to two different audiences. You want the people who've mastered Commandos, who've mastered Desperados. You also want to make it somewhat palatable to someone who's never touched this genre.
Yeah, so I think for the older games, we just sort of succeeded in that. Like, they're still very much catered to the old school audience, or the people who enjoy these type of games. And that, like, it's a very core game. Like, it's very hard. Desperados improved a lot on that, but especially Shadow Tactics is just very brutal. It has a tight learning curve. Once you're in it, I think it's no problem at all, and everybody can actually, like, my dad, who's like, I don't know how old he was 70 at the time or something, he actually played Shadow Tactics after having not played anything for like forever. You played StarCraft back in the day, and now Shadow Tactics, and he played it on easy, and it took him like 100 hours to complete it, and dozens phone calls to me, like, what do I do here? Like, this is hard. But he managed to complete it, even though he's not a gamer at all. So it is possible to do that. But it takes some getting used to. And regarding these badges or challenges, these are made rather quickly in the early games. Like, there was not a lot of thought process going into them. It was like, okay, we want additional things to do on these maps because we put so much work into them, and then you're done after 2 hours and you just never touch them again. There's a lot of replay value in these games. I think, like, it's not really shown a lot, and that's what the badges were there to do as well. It's like showing people that you can play this in many ways, because that's something many stealth games struggle with. They always put in a lot of like options, but you just choose one path, and that's what you see. And then you don't even realize that you could have done something very differently if it's not communicated to you. And the badges help there. They just show you what's possible, and they just show you, on the one side, it's you can go left or right, and then there's a badge for left or right in the end, and you can be like, okay, I could have taken the other path, which is rather obvious. But then there's stuff like don't touch any bushes or don't save at all, and people are like, how the hell are you supposed to do that? But it works. Like, it you can do that, and it's not extremely hard to do it. You just have to, once you know how these things work, you can get into that. And so what we usually try to do is, and those are, I think, the most successful badges or the most fun badges, are ones that really challenge the way you tackle that specific mission. For example, in Shadow Tactics, the second mission is a convoy and there's a bridge over a river. And one of the badges is don't step into the water, like don't swim across the river. So you have to take the bridge suddenly. And everybody swims when you play it for the first time, because the bridge is guarded and there's no need to do that. And then you realize, whoa, I can do that. And it changes how you play the whole mission by just putting one extra rule on top of it. And this is what we try to do, like things that actually transform the mission in a way and show you what's possible in the game, because there's a lot of stuff possible if you use the characters and combine the skills.
And to your point about like replayability in stealth games, I think that's been one of like the major success points of the Hitman franchise, and how they're up to their, I'm not even sure how we count them now, I guess like Hitman 3 live service. And one of the things I hear a lot from fans is the freedom that you have. And I think, as you said, like that's a very understated element of games like this. Because when we look at kind of like lesser stealth games, or when most people think of a stealth game, they think of, okay, I start here, here's my target, and it's just like a very linear path that you must take to get to that. And that was kind of how a lot of stealth games were designed in the 90s and in the 2000s. You had enemies with very fixed patterns, patrol routes. If you do anything that's kind of like out of line, the enemy sees you, the mission's over. And then when we got to games like Hitman and with Shadow Tactics and so on, as you said, like this is when we began to see this idea of, what if you can do a mission without using a disguise? Or do a mission when you never touch a ground? And in one way, it is a way of proving mastery of these games, but in another, it can be viewed as like another way of approaching these things. And I think that's one of the things that we kind of see, at least in like modern stealth games, has been getting away from this idea that there is only the right way to get through a mission. Now, the right way is, well, how do you want to do it for tonight? Do you want to go up the skyscraper? Do you want to go in the sewer? Do you want to use a frying pan and finish someone off like that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is something that our games struggle to communicate still, because I very often read reviews because they're so hard, right? I mean, this is like you mentioned Hitman, and I think it's very fun to watch. Like, this is very much an outside perspective. I don't know anybody in the Hitman team, so I don't know what they like. Just watch some talks and stuff. But from looking from the outside, they made a very interesting development when I look at how the games develop. Like, they moved, like, they're doing social stealth, as they say themselves, right? It's a lot about disguises. And there's a lot, not much. They're very different from our games, from the actual gameplay loop, because we have a very tight gameplay loop about actually executing mechanics. Like you actually do kills all the time, and you need to distract people while you do kills. And this is a very like strategy sort of aspect from RTS games or tactics games. That is something that is very strong in our games, and it's very optimized a lot. And Hitman did less and less of that. Like basically you're just running around in these areas, looking around for extremely cool things to do, and you do them, and they're fucking awesome. I'm sorry, not a lot of just and they're just so much fun. But it's very different, and it's also very handcrafted. I think that this might be where I'm actually wrong, because I haven't played that much Hitman. Like, I'm not a complete master in it, but I don't think there's that much systemic stuff going on. Like, this is more in, we look at Dishonored or something like that. They have a lot of systemic stuff going on where you have goals, but you have these weird abilities that allow you to break everything in the game, sort of, and get creative and get crazy. And because everything is very systemic, the guards will just do it, and if it becomes unpolished, then it's okay, because you like did the right, like they put systems and self-expression of the player very high in Dishonored. And I think they do that as well in Hitman, but it's much more constructed paths. Like, it's much more, you can do this, you can do that, you can do that, and there's a lot of them, and they're all awesome, and these locations are insane. I don't know how they do it. And our game is somewhere in between, because we still do have a lot of mechanical execution and puzzles that are just sort of puzzly in a way. And I see a lot of people, when they are reviewing our game, sometimes they're like, there's only one solution. Like, you always have to do what the designers want you to do, because the game is so hard that they don't see the other solutions. But there have been like 10 other solutions to what they were doing. They're just, because you try so often and you iterate so often, it can make you feel like that was the only solution because it was so hard. Like, there cannot be another one. But there are plenty. Like, there are 5 that we design and 15 we didn't even think of for every situation. So this is something we're actually trying to do better in Shadow Gambit. And we also, during Desperados, we try to communicate better that it's not like there's so many options you can do. And I think Shadow Gambit has some interesting thoughts on how we can approach this. So we can get to that later.
Yeah, and that is, I think, such a really interesting point, that for a lot of people, when they play games like this, especially when they play difficult games, they only tend to see, what is the strategy that's like right in front of me, and then they'll kind of like bang their head against the wall to make that fit. And it's very hard, as I'm sure for you and for any other developers watching this, to kind of explain to the player that, hey, we have all these other ways, you're just not seeing them. And it's like that kind of like onboarding that I think is very difficult for games like this. And I would be fascinated. Like, as you said, like, we don't have anyone here from IO Interactive, because there are others too I would love to kind of pick their brains on, in terms of how do you kind of get the player into that mindset of, okay, we're giving you all these crazy tools and all these abilities, how do we get them to do all that? Because as you mentioned a minute ago with Dishonored, like, I played through Dishonored myself, and I enjoyed that one, and loved Prey as well. And it's like that very kind of like meaty like tool set that they give the player to then just say, okay, well, the enemy's over here. What do you want to do? Like, how do you want to get there? And the game will kind of allow them to do these different routes. And I guess, like, to give you a question, or do I have a question on top of that? What is kind of like your thoughts on games that try to have kind of the, as I said earlier, the right way? That the game is built around that, yes, you can do this, this, and this, but there is the true route. And I've seen some developers kind of go in 2 different ways with that. Like, some don't like that. Like, they prefer, yes, there is an end goal, but we're not defining what that end goal is. For at Dishonored and what Arcane has done, like, one thing that I kind of hear some of the issues, and some things that I felt, is that sometimes there are like different routes or different endings feel like a little forced. Like, I know a lot of people kind of bounce off of Dishonored and Dishonored 2 by the fact that you had this challenge of get through the entire game without using any powers. So some people will view that as, well, that must be, the good ending, or, the master ending. And kind of, when they get that in their heads, they just feel like, well, there's no other way to play. Like, if I don't play this without any powers, then I'm not playing the game, as a developer intended.
Yeah, so for me, and some like many of us at the studio, I cannot speak for everyone because of course, but many of us, these types of games that actually allow this, and I think Arcane is very good at doing that. Like they have extremely cool sandboxes that players can express themselves in. Are some of the favorite games. Like for me, my favorite genre is what Arcane is doing, like the immersive sim. That is what I want in a game. Like I want, and I'm not talking about the different endings. You know, this is sort of a narrative thing, and I know why they do it. They add on top of it too. Well, I think I know why they do it. That is not what that's a gimmick for me, right? I mean, and I'm sure it's an incredible amount of work to get it done, but that's not why the game is fun to me. Like I'm gonna be at the ending, and then I'm like, yeah, okay, cool, I got that one. If I'm gonna replay it, then not to get another ending, but to do different stuff, choose different skills, and interact with the systems in a different way, and get a whole new experience out of it. Because that's where I think the joy in these games comes from, and that is a thing that is extremely hard to communicate, as we said before. Like that is why I think Arcane has been struggling sort of for quite some time. Again, outside idiot knowledge, but they have, like, the games haven't sold as well as they should have, in my opinion, because they are masterpieces. Like Prey is my favorite game, probably all time, the new one, and it didn't sell well. Like, and they, so they struggle with that. And this is something I heard them say in interviews and stuff, that it's hard to communicate what's great about these games unless you actually play them. And something that I believe that's hard, because these games have so many different paths to choose. You have to make so many different paths available, and you have to create so many things that it's a little less polished. Like if you take a AAA game that focuses on one thing only, it can polish that thing to death, and it feels extremely good to play a shooter like that. Like if you're playing Doom, love Doom, and it just feels so good to shoot in Doom. It doesn't feel that great to shoot in Arcane games. Like it feels okay. Like if you're playing Prey like a shooter, you're gonna be like, this is a bad shooter. Like I don't know, I'm gonna play Doom. If you play Arcane like it's Prey like it's intended to be played, and that is not a path by the designer, it's like experiment with the sandbox, then it's insanely cool. So that is the communication struggle, and I think that both type of games are valid, and I both exist. I personally prefer the more sandboxy approach in games, because I like to tinker with that type of stuff. But I'm a game designer, right? I think that these types of games are very much for game designers, like the Arcane games. They are very much for game designers. Not only, but that it's right up the alley of many game designers, I think, because you see systems and you see how they work, and you see the beauty of it, and you see all the work that went into doing that. And yeah, so I like both. So to say, because the initial question was, how do I feel about games that have this intended path? Like, I think both is fine. It's just not my preference. I think the games that are very, and that's the sad part for me about it, because I prefer the sandbox games that don't sell well, and the others sell extremely well. Like if we're looking at all the great games Sony makes, like The Last of Us, all these Naughty Dog games, like God of War, these huge blockbuster story-driven action games, they're very much linear. Like there's not much systemic choice and intricacy in that, and there's a reason for that, right? I get it, but that is what sells very well, and that's the thing that people want, which is a little sad for me, because I would love to see the other games on the same level. I want to see both of them succeed, and not only the ones that are more like that are more movie-like. And because my issue with that is more, games are interactive, right? And I think that Arcane type of games and systemic games, they embrace interactivity, while the others embrace movie elements, like linear storytelling, cutscenes, production values in that, the emotions that come from that, which is extremely strong, and I get why that works. But I would love to see the games succeed that actually embrace being a game more, and thus have to sacrifice other stuff.
And question came in earlier from Pony. They were asking, they kind of bounce off of Shadow Tactics, and their question was, as far as I know, the planning mode didn't stop gameplay / time, and they were curious about what was the decision behind that.
So you can get into Desperados 3 then, because it stops time then from now, and it stops time in Shadow Gambit as well, so maybe the games are for you now. We had that in the game in the beginning, like it did pause time, and then we did internal playtests, and we saw people play, and we didn't like the way that looked. Like they constantly paused the game, and it was a very fluid, I don't know, like experience. It didn't look like we wanted it to look, and the big aspect in our games is real time, right? I mean, we're not turn based, so and I totally get that many people prefer the turn based stuff because it's less stressful. Like you don't have to be fast; you can just chill out and do your turn, strategize everything, send the turn away, and then you get the turn back. And it's a very more relaxing way to play. And this is, I think, one of the reasons also why games maybe didn't exist for a longer time is because real-time strategy games as well, they're dying, right? I mean, it's a genre that's struggling extremely hard, and I think it's because of that in certain parts. It's just very hard to execute and play and not that fun for many people. So we watched it, and people were like, I'm jumping off that building, pause. I'm going to check everything out. Go to that bush, pause. And it was a very fragmented experience, and we just didn't like that. And so we were like, no, we're not going to do that. And then people started requesting it after we launched Shadow Tactics, just like you do now, and I get it. And we're like, I just want to pause. Like, why isn't that in there? And we were like, yeah, we tried it and it didn't work. And it was one of the few things that Shadow Tactics was very well received. So we didn't get that much negative feedback. So it wasn't that easy for us to be like, what do we change for Desperados? Like, everything seemed to be well. And this was one thing that was mentioned. Well, okay, let's try it. So we put it in again, and we instantly realized that we were wrong, and it should have been in there. And it just, for different types of people and different player types, it's just something they enjoy much more. It's just pause the game, check it out, take your time, because it's strategic and tactical, and you should have time to check it out. So, yeah, that's why we did it back then and why we don't do it anymore.
Yeah, and it is a very tough problem for a law designed to solve like that when you're trying to figure out just how many tools you want to give the player. I mean, I've been seeing this in some of the games I've been playing lately, when they're trying to kind of square that circle between, we want this game to be hard and challenging and all that, and we want you to use, these tools. But we also want to make sure that someone can play this game, and maybe we give them, some additional abilities or something that's not quite the focus of the core gameplay loop. And it's very difficult to get that balance right, because some people will then say, I think this goes back to your point about Arcane, that some people will think, well, I like using all this crazy stuff, this is what the game should be like, or this is how I'm going to show this game off. But then you completely disregard all this other cool stuff that the developer has. And like when I played my first run through of Prey, I did that with the I forget what they're called, not plasmids, whatever the special powers were. And it was an interesting idea, but conversely, it just meant that, hey, all the stuff the developer created, all these crazy powers, I did none of that. And that could easily color my experience, whereas someone else could play the game like, you know what? I'm just going to play this like Doom meets Bioshock. Run around, shotgun power, and that's what I think, an arcade game is like.
I think that when you decide to make games like that are more systemic and that are more sandboxy and that give players choice and embrace interactivity and choice, then that is a decision you make. Like, you say that's fine. Like, it's fine if people have very different experiences, and that's the beauty of it. Like, the beauty of maybe us talking after playing Prey for the first time and having very different experiences that's the cool thing. Like, if we're both playing Call of Duty, the experience is going to be the same, 95%, because they have this very railroaded, perfectly polished experience. Whereas maybe you didn't take the plasmids or whatever they're called, and I went all in on them and started mind controlling everything and did crazy stuff like that. And then we can talk about how we solved situations and puzzles in ways that are completely different, and we get excited about it. And we want to try again and do the thing the other person did. And that is the beauty of these games. And so I think you accept that. It's the same for us. Like, we have this a little bit different with the last Tinker we did at the beginning. Was very linear and very railroaded. Like, whenever we saw players do something that we didn't expect, we fixed it. We were just like, oh no, you can't do that. We cut it out and we made it more streamlined. And then when we made Shadow Tactics, there was a huge shift in how we viewed this. And whenever we saw someone do something we didn't expect, we were like, okay, how can we support this? How can we put it in and make it, and it makes scope explode in a way. So you need to be very careful with the abilities. And we're like, I think Shadow Tactics is very tightly designed. There's not much in it. Everything in it has a purpose, and we were lucky that commandos and stuff existed. That's how we could make it this tight. We could build on that. Like, we would never have been able to do that when we invented this. And yeah, so I think getting that balance right depends on what you want to do. And then once you decide that this is what you want to do, you try to do as few things as possible, but the ones needed for the paths you want people to take and how large you want the sandbox to be. And you accept that they're going to have wildly different experiences because that's why you do it in the first place. And I believe that these choices of in any kind of game like this, they are cool because you do not get to experience the other thing. That's what makes them feel like valuable choices. If there's a mission and there's a T-junction and I go left or right and I have a different experience, like we have that in Shadow Tactics, sometimes we have missions that are like, you can poison the guy in one example, or you can, I think, shoot him with the sniper from a tower. And this is the Hitman approach, right? And when you do the one thing, you can't do the other. Like, that's important. So you have to play it again, or you're going to be like, your choice matters. And that is, so you don't lose the other stuff. I think it's still there, and the choice is only meaningful because you didn't do
it. Yep. And when the game is set up to have, instead of it being like, as we said, like, the main way to play is to do this, now it's again like, here's all these crazy challenges and optional stuff. What do you want to do this time? Do you want to do this, this, and this? Do you want to do this and this? And I feel like that is a much stronger way to approach these games. And as we were saying earlier, I think it's a better way to kind of introduce the player to the fact that there is replayability. That's not just, okay, I kill the target, get to the exit, we never touch this mission ever again. It's, okay, that was one way to do this. Now let's go do it like this. And like we've said, like, it's very hard, and there's definitely a greater topic here in terms of, like, weaning the player onto multiple options. I don't think we have the time to get into tonight.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could talk about that for quite some time. I think it's a very tough nut to crack. Like, and we try to do it with the badges a little bit and show options exist, and have obvious options. And then once people get into the systems, understand the games, they can look back at things and be like, could have done it that way as well.
And I guess talking about, like, kind of going with, like, different powers and, like, different abilities, one thing I want to ask you is, with Shadow Tactics, like, outside of using the sniper class, it's very much a hands-on, more, all close-range combat. Well, Desperados, you had a lot more, like, range abilities. Again, being in a cowboy setting, everyone or most people have access to guns. Did, like, the focus on, like, melee to range, does that, like, change anything in your mind in terms of stealth design? Or is it really more like apples to apples in terms of, like, creating the scenarios, creating the gameplay?
So I was in the beginning, I was against for Desperados doing a lot with guns. I knew it was sort of required by the setting, and that's why we decided to do it then, because we were like, we have to do it. It's a cowboy game. We can't have a cowboy game without guns. But I wanted to stick to the way guns worked in Shadow Tactics because they don't get in the way with stealth. Like, they are just, the stealth is the key thing, and we knew how to do that. And I was afraid that if we added combat as something that's more valid, because that is, like, it adds a huge dimension of stuff to the game that needs to work. The AI needs to work completely differently. Like, they had to be able to handle that better, and you need better feedback in combat. Shadow Tactics had so many obscure systems and things around the combat and the alarm state that exists that, like, I mean, people always load. This is, again, a huge feature in the games. And to the question from earlier, by the way, I can say this. No, not going to say because it's not true. Sorry. But for our games, the quick load is very important. Like, the quick iteration is very important. And so many people don't even go down that path. And like, you fail and you keep playing and get into the scrappy stuff, right? I mean, that happens a lot in the other stealth games. And that is a huge part of fun in those games. But for the commandos in our games, it's not. Like, we basically remove that a lot for Shadow Tactics. Just iterate on the perfect stealth loop, and then you're going to be able to do it. And so for Desperados, we were torn between these two things. It was like, okay, you can always quick load in like 3 seconds or something, whatever the load time is. So not many people are going to go down the path of failing and starting using guns. So how much time do you want to put into that? And because if you do, then it should feel good, and it's a cowboy game, blah, blah. So we talked a lot about it, and we did a lot of iterations for it, and we did the same for Shadow Gambit now, and there we also had interesting discoveries. But yeah, for Desperados, it was okay. We're gonna make a unique gun then for every character, so have them feel special again. Like we have the guy with a big shotgun who can blast multiple enemies. We have Cooper with double guns, and we have people with single guns. We have the sniper guy. We have these archetypes in there, and we put a lot of work into making combat feel fun and more fun. And I don't think many people realized it's there because most people just press F8 and they're just gonna go out of there. And we did the same thing a little bit as with the badges, is that we had something in Desperados 3 that's called the Baron's Challenges. It's sort of extra content for every mission. There's one, and it remixes the mission in a very, like, sometimes very crazy ways. It's sort of like a challenge mode, really. And something that we did is that we created one mission where you are only allowed to use guns in that mode. So you don't have any skills except the guns. And this is how we sort of tried. I mean, it happens very late in the game, so people are usually played through the game already if they do that. But this is where you sort of realize how the combat actually works and how you wait a minute, this works. This is actually fun, I think, for many people. So it was again trying to do that deliberately and show that it works in the game, but it's something that wasn't used as much. But it was important to do. Like, I was wrong to say we shouldn't do it. It's important for a Western game to have gunfights.
And what you just said there, like, about, like, the failure, like, working through the failure side of stealth, that, I think, takes me to a very interesting question I want to ask you. For a lot of these kinds of stealth games, as you said, like, there's oftentimes two ways of what happens when you get caught. One is, it's usually a game over. The alarm sounds, 20, 50 guards surround you and kill you. And then there are some games where it becomes like that kind of like escalating amount of skill. Like Hitman, I think, does this quite well. That if you get caught, now becomes a third-person shooter. And different stealth games, I think, handle this very differently, like that. Like, I remember when I played Shadow Tactics and a little bit with Desperados, like, you get caught, as you said, like, a lot of people just hit F8. I don't want, why do I want to play through this mission when everyone knows I'm there and all the guards are alerted? And there's some games and some developer philosophies where it's kind of like, we want the player to kind of take it as far as it can go. That, let's say I do get caught, and I get into a fight, and now all the guards are angry, so now I play through more aggressively, and now it escalates like that. And I wanted to ask you, like, with Shadow Tactics and even, like, evolving this into Desperados and Shadow Gambit, how has, like, the approach to, like, a failure state or a fail state has, like, changed or evolved in these games?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, because I think that's the fail states in stealth games are one of the core things that you need to decide on, and they are also something that, for us, since we have that quick save, quick load loop, it's a very different situation as for a Hitman, I think, because loading just takes a minute in that game. Like, you can't do what we're doing in that game. Like, it would not be fun to fail. So they have a very different approach to difficulty. Like, they need all these types of games. They need a very different approach to difficulty. And our games can be very difficult because it's intended to fail. Like, that's part of them. And it's fun. Like, it's only fun because you failed 5 times before. Then you do it the 6th time, usually. It's a very weird dynamic. And this has been very true for the Commandos, and this is one of the principles we took and we implemented into Shadow Tactics. We put a huge amount of work, and we always do, into the save system and the quickness of quick saves. Like, quick saves in Shadow Tactics, if you're on an SSD and stuff, or especially in Desperados, we improved that a lot, and Shadow Gambit as well. Like, they are insanely fast. Like, it's a couple of seconds. That's it. And that was important. Like, that doesn't just happen, right? I mean, there's a lot of work going into making that happen, because we knew, like, if the quick save takes 10 seconds or the quick load, then the game is dead. Like, there's no game if we don't manage to do that. Because we have a different approach to fail states, because they don't really exist in our game. But this is also a reason for many people to believe that there's only one solution, as we talked about before, because they fail and they fail and they fail, and be like, man, there's only this one solution. And then it's something that narrows the niche we're already in a lot, because it's like, most people, I think, they want this back and forth, and they don't want to play this rigid, perfect stealth style. They want to just have fun. They just want to go in there, stab a couple guys, and then when somebody sees them, they pull out the gun and start shooting and have this sort of experience. This is something that has been, I think this is also why pure stealth doesn't exist in any AAA game. Like every AAA game is you do exactly that. You mark a couple of guards, sneak around the camp in the Ubisoft game, you pick them up, and then combat and chaos ensues, and the fun of the mechanics starts growing in. And we didn't have that in our games much. We put it in more in Desperados. And now with Shadow Gambit, we're trying to reach a much larger audience. Not saying that we're changing, like trying to be sellout or something, but the games get more expensive and we need to expand our audience because it's just we're 35 people, not 15 anymore, and the games are bigger and they look better. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's expensive to make them, and also we want more people to have fun in this genre. Like we don't want it to be for just a few people who are into that specific kind of thing. And to everybody who is, don't worry, it's still in there. You can crank up the difficulty. But something that we've done is that we've changed fundamental things about the failure state in Shadow Gambit that have a huge impact on how rigid the game feels. Our old games, they feel very rigid because usually if you fail, you load, and it just feels like you're in that type of lane. And there's multiple lanes, but you're still in that type of mindset. And for Shadow Gambit, we did a couple of things to fix that. And the biggest one is Shadow Gambit has magic, right? It's a fantasy world. It's not a fantasy world. It's an alternate reality with magical elements in it. So it's, I don't know, magical history, you could call it. And one thing, because your characters, they're all undead. Like, they are all cursed pirates. They have already died. So when they die, they are not dead. And in our old games, the main failure state is one of your characters dies, and there's a mission over screen coming and saying, like, the mission's done. You need to reload now because one of your characters died. And that is not the case in Shadow Gambit anymore. Like, if one of the characters die, they are in sort of this state of their soul is dismantling from their body, whatever lore stuff, and you can revive them. And there's a system around that. You can't do it infinitely, blah, blah. But that changes so much about how the game plays with the failure state. Because one of your characters dies, and guards swarming, the alarm is sounding, and then you look at it, and you're like, okay, what can I do here now? You know, and you may usually pause the game with the pause mode, and you're looking at it, and you're like, okay, I can use this skill to take out that guy. I'm just going to do that. Pause again, check what's happening. And then you just need to get to your character in time, because there's a timer for how long you can actually revive them. And then you can keep playing. And this is one aspect that does a lot in that regard. We also added more feedback for the alarm states, like UI feedback. There's a timer that shows you how long the alarm is going to last. There's a spot on the map that shows you where the alarm was sounded, so you can play around and be like, oh, they're all going to go to this spot now, so I can strategize around that. I can sneak behind their backs. I can lure them over here. This is where the new around, stuff like that. And a huge part, which is one of the biggest changes, because we have magic in Shadow Gambit, is the abilities of characters. And they are very much more crazy and cooler. We are not restricted to realism and things like stones and whistles and doing the same things. You can do very cool things with characters in Shadow Gambit. And that changes that. Well, it's not even the fail state anymore, but yeah, the fail state of the stealth portion, basically. It changes a lot because you are very powerful in that. Even without guns, you can reposition yourself by teleporting. You know, it's a lot more dynamic what you can do in that. And I really like it. And once, like, when I play the game now, and I'm a hardcore stealth guy, like, I like my stealth, I did my stealth stuff, and then maybe I fail, and I'm like, I don't care. I'm just going to keep playing after I fail. I'm just going to take out these guys and enjoy this skirmish type of gameplay that happens.
And that's, I think, a very interesting point about, like, giving the player, like, more crazy powers and more unique abilities. Because that's another thing that we've kind of seen, like AAA stealth games have been doing a lot more over the past decade. The whole idea of detective vision, that you can just hit a button, you now see x-rays of all the enemies and where they are and what they're looking at. And it's another thing that has, like, that kind of, like, push and pull to it. Like, some people who prefer, you know, traditional stealth, you know, the thief style, the original Hitman, where they want the player to be very much like, as we've said before, like, it's that perfect route. I want to play this level exactly right, never get seen, never get detected, get in, get out, and done. And then we see a lot in, like, kind of modern games that, and I think this really stems back to when the first Batman Arkham Asylum game came out, where now stealth is like, you're the most powerful player or the most powerful piece on the board. How do you use that to your advantage? Like, you're no longer the one to be scared, or you're no longer the one that's sneaking around. It's like, okay, how do I pick off these guys to complete my mission?
Yeah, I think that especially AAA had to move in that direction because it's just the games are so expensive and they need a certain amount of players, and there just aren't enough players who actually enjoy hardcore stealth. Like, I think that stealth has been going out of these games for that reason, and it's a good one. Like, most people want a more fun, non-challenging experience. I'm not saying they want it easy, but they want a level of difficulty that is works a certain way, and it's more about a fun experience than one that makes you think too hard. Like, if you look at puzzles in these types of games now in AAA, they're not very hard. Like, they're more about if they're having fun solving them and not about actually having to think about them really hard, because people get stuck, and if you're stuck, it's frustrating, and nobody likes that. So, well, not nobody, but many people don't like that, because if you're coming home from work and you just want to relax a little bit, instead of watching a movie, you're playing a game, you don't want to be sitting there braining hardcore about what your next move is. You just want to enjoy. So I think that is why a lot of the stealth has been pushed out of these games, because it has a bad rap for being very binary, which it doesn't have to be, but that's what happened because they used to be very binary. And B, the gameplay can be a little too challenging. And I'm not like, I don't want to put any fire into this casual versus core discussion. Like, that's not at all my point. Like, I enjoy both, and I think it's valid. Each of these two things are. I just think that that's what's happening, and that's for a reason, because you need to sell the copies, and you need to make something that more and be inclusive and have people enjoy the game, and that works better if it's easier. Yeah, so I think, and I also think that you could create, because you mentioned the detective mode, I think that's more of it's also a feature that helps guide players more. Like, it's not like a magical ability, I think, that you actually use to interact with enemies. It's more about showing people what they can do. Like, this is an interactive object. So the art team doesn't have to make, like, it can look realistic in game and have cool graphics, but you can put the highlighter on and be like, this is interactive. This is interactive until you learn it. Because it's a very hard thing to do it without that type of stuff, and be like, you can climb up this wall, but you cannot climb up that wall, and that needs to be consistent throughout every game, and you need to get that language across to players. So it's a UX help more than an actual skill, I think. So I think even with magical abilities or real abilities, you could design both ways. You could, in both settings, make a game that is extremely narrow and hardcore stealth, or you could make, and very punishing, or you could make a game that is extremely open, not punishing at all.
All right. And as a quick time check, we are just over an hour in, so I figure we'll spend another like 10 to 15 minutes, give or take, and then we'll begin to wrap things up. So, for chat, if you have any questions about stealth gameplay, about Shadow Gambit, or anything like that, this will be kind of like first warning to get those in. So, since we've been talking about Shadow Gambit for the last few minutes, I think this is a good time to kind of like officially get more into that discussion, because we've been discussing over the last hour about kind of like that evolution that you and the rest of Mimimi have done in terms of going from Shadow Tactics, or we could even say going from Commandos to Shadow Tactics to Desperados and now Shadow Gambit. And as you've been describing over the last few minutes, you've been discussing kind of like how it's a little bit more freeform, or a little bit less rigid in that respect. And for people who may be tuning in late, or maybe just thinking more about that, like, what else is like going on? Like, how has philosophy has changed going from, again, Shadow Tactics and Desperados, to what you want to do now in Gambit?
Yeah. So when you develop games, you usually have creative pillars, right? And one of our pillars from the beginning has been play it your way. In Shadow Tactics already, it's been, we want people to be in a sandbox and experience that, and we amped that up with Desperados, and now we're going full power on that with Shadow Gambit. So the main thing that we wanted to change and embrace is this aspect. We've had it before, and we wanted to put it on a pedestal and just go all in with it. So the main things that have changed there is that in our older games, we used, like, we had the mission, and there was a set starting point, and you had to get to a fixed ending point, or sometimes two. And between that, there were turns and twists, and you could go left and you could go right. There were always paths to choose. It was never just linear. We always had at least two of them. But it still was like a linear experience, so going from point A to point B, and there was not much choice from starting and ending. The other thing is the characters were predetermined by us. So we decided what characters you have in the mission, which was very important to create that very tight stealth gameplay. Because we know exactly what abilities you have, so we can build the levels not countering them, but making it fun for you with those abilities, challenging you to use these abilities in clever ways because we know which ones you have. And then for Shadow Gambit, but something people wanted to do always is have free character selection, right? That was something they were like, oh man, I want to choose the characters. Why do I have to, And when we made the pitch for Shadow Gambit, that was one of the core things that we wanted to do. So we wanted to give players the ability to choose characters for a mission, and also the ability to choose what characters they actually have. In Desperados and Shadow Tactics, it's predetermined by story when a character joins the team. And in Shadow Gambit, we build everything in a more modular way. So there's a small limit. You have to, you start with one character, and then you can choose between two characters because you need to make sure that you have one type of skill set. Otherwise, it gets already rough. And after that, there's 8 characters in the game. You have free choice from all characters. You can just decide which character to unlock at which point. So we are giving a lot of control that we used to have away, and we are going hardcore into the arcane type of. It's a sandbox. Just do what you want to do with it, and so we never know what kind of characters and skills you're going to have on a mission. And then we have another thing which I really enjoy that goes into that, and I mentioned the locations before being linear. Now it's an island. Like every location in the game is a mission that takes place on islands. We have a couple of those in the game. They're very large. They're probably larger than most Shadow Tactics maps are. And the cool thing about islands is that you can swim around the whole island. Like it is a sandbox in itself, right? You can explore the whole space. It's not like in our old games where we had to make these arbitrary, well, not invisible walls, but the map ends at some point in the city. Like if it's a city map and you just see 2 blocks of it, the city is probably going to go on for miles. You can never go there. With the islands, you can go everywhere on that island. And for all of the missions, we let you spawn. It's predetermined, but you can come from any side you want to. You get the mission, you get the briefing, and the game tells you need to do this. You need to go into this camp on that location. And you see it in an overview map, and you can then decide, I want to take these characters for that mission because I think they're going to be good for doing what I have to do here. And I want to start from the north, east, south, west, whatever, because I'd like to do that path. Or maybe I've chosen that path the last time I was here. It's another part. You revisit these islands, like you're not there once. And this is sort of, the sandbox just grew immensely. And it is a lot about this, play the game the way you want to play it. Like there is a lot of choice in it, in how you want to structure the, larger parts of the game this time as well, and not only in small setups like in Shadow Tactics, where I was like, do I want to kill this guard first or that guard first? Now it is on every layer in the game. There's choices.
Mm-hmm. And with kind of like the choices of the characters, one thing I was going to ask you about, some stealth games, like one thing that, again, like going back to kind of like the AAA side of things, have been allowing the player to unlock new abilities, things that increase your ability to stealth faster or reduce guard detection. Do you have any of that in like Shadow Game in terms of being able to upgrade characters, or are they very much like once they're unlocked, this is their tool set for the remainder of the game?
We have a little bit of it. Like there's one upgrade for every character that you can unlock that usually enhances a skill or gives them a new skill. But that real RPG-like progression that a lot of games have, it's something that we might do in the future, I think, because it's very motivating. It's fun to do. But I mentioned before that we are very clear about our games being clean and easy to understand and easy to read and having clear rules. And this gets very hard to do when you add these sorts of progression things in there that are like, you can move 5% faster, 10% faster, and something that like we don't have at all, which most RPGs, of course, have, is scaling enemy stats, right? You can say this goblin has 5 HP, this goblin has 15 HP, this goblin has 50 HP. So if you're leveling up the damage, you can scale the game, and it stays balanced. Our games are always like, you stab a guy, he's dead. there's no hit points. It is something you can crack. I think Assassin's Creed started doing it when they added stuff like that, but it's not something that we actually want to do. We enjoy that part about our games, at least currently, that they're very clean in the rules and they're very open, but there's not that much branching on that part. Like we want the branching to be meaningful in characters. It'd be like, you have this cool guy and he can do these things and only he can do these things or she can do these things in that way. And that's what makes them cool. And also we have 8 characters, like having 8 characters be skilled up and stuff like that in a game that has rules like ours that is not scalable like an RPG is, I think, very, very hard to do and balance it. It's already hard to balance this game with static characters that don't develop.
And with the 8 characters, as you said earlier, we're going to be doing more magical based abilities and all that. Are the enemies being designed, or are the enemies having their own abilities to compensate? Because that's another thing that we see from some stealth games, is that the enemy is like very basic, and we're given all these crazy powers and tools just to kind of like mess with them. So I guess like, what's kind of like the approach to enemy design in Shadow Gambit?
So our approach is always, as with the other stuff, to keep it as simple as we can while having interesting gameplay. So we do keep the basics that we have alive. Like there's the same sort of type of enemy guard, the one that's hard to distract, the one that's easy to distract, this type of stuff that's in there because it's required for the game to function. And we don't want to put in guards or guard types, enemy types that are not really that different, that don't really make you play differently, that just bloated in a way. Like, and they don't have clear rules. Like something that we didn't like about the original Desperados, for example, was I think it had 13 enemy types or 15 enemy types. They were like, you didn't really realize that at all. And they all had, this guy doesn't react to this distraction, and this guy doesn't react to that distraction, and this guy reacts. So it was very singular things that there's a huge matrix of what these guys do and don't do, and it's not very intuitive. And like I want to know what my skills do and how the systems in the game react to the skills. So that's very important to us. So we keep it clean and simple. We don't do that kind of stuff. But we wanted to, it's like, since we're ramping up the player with these magical abilities, we also wanted to ramp up the enemies with magical abilities to make like it more even and more fun, to have like enemy types that you need to work around. So we came up with 2.5. One of the enemies, there I need to mention something that we did in the game as well to so how they work. We made the vision cones a lot smaller in Shadow Gambit because we wanted things to be able to fit on one screen more. In Shadow Tactics and Desperados, you get seen from off screen quite a lot because of the vision cones. We didn't want to get rid of that, so we wanted to make and when you play the game, it's funny, nobody's gonna notice. Like people, the view cone is very different. People, because that happened to us, we were playing for like 1 week after the change. We're like, we can't go that small like that. That's gonna be so stupid. And we just did it, and just nobody notices it. Your brain just instantly is like, yeah, that's how it's always been. It's not that. So we made the view cone smaller, but that allowed us to make enemies with larger view cones. So we have sharpshooters and snipers in the enemy team that have these extremely long view cones that are sort of scanning large areas. That it's cool. You need to get to them first because they're hard to interact with. Those are the half new enemy type. Then we have the kindred, who are within the world, like they are sort of sisterhood within the Inquisition, that are being trained in a very special way, and they are connected with each other. Like they are at least 2 in a pair, sometimes it's more, that have a sort of magical connection of the mind. And if one of them dies, the other one will notice it and sound the alarm, and also revive their kin. So you have to take them out at the same time, which incentivizes teamwork, using character abilities at the same time, using the shadow mode, which is one of the most fun features in our games, making simultaneous takedowns, so that enemy type plays into that. And it's interesting if you get into a situation, you see them, and you're like, oh, there's 2 kindred. You cannot start by killing the one kindred. You need to complete the setup in a way that you can get to both of them at the same time, which is a fun challenge. And then we have another one who's called the Prognosticar, I think. And he's a sort of a guy that can sort of see the future, very short term. And he's a very weird religious guy, but he can sort of see the future in a short term, and he can freeze you in place. So what this character will do is, whenever they realize a player character is there, they see you, they hear you, you target them with any skill, not just attacks, but also distractions. They will freeze the character who does that in place, put a cage around them, sound the alarm, and the character, you cannot use that character while it's caged, and it dies in 10 seconds or something. But while that enemy is doing that, they're vulnerable, so you can go in there and stab them. So you also need 2 characters to sort of deal with these, but in a different way in the Kindred. That's what we're doing currently with the enemies. Yeah.
Interesting. And on the subject of detection, that was one thing that I wanted to ask you about in terms of like general stealth gameplay before I forget. What is like kind of like your like thoughts or philosophy when it comes to like the different ways a player can be detected? Like this is something that can really greatly vary in stealth games. Like there are some games where you can make all the sound you want, but the second you step in front of a guy, that's it. There are some games where you step in front of the guy, you see that lovely little bar start filling up, and then they get detected. And it's not one of those aspects that I think greatly varies in terms of like the philosophy the designer wants to have. So with Mimimi, like what's kind of been like your approach, or like how do you want like detection and like that to kind of like escalate or go out of control for the player?
Yeah, so we have both in our games depending on difficulty settings. So you can set the game in a way that you're basically instantly detected once you enter a guard's vision, and there's no room for you to play in, but that's the hardcore. That's not even hard, it's hardcore. Like it's the last difficulty that we can choose. What we prefer is to give you a lot of leeway with that. Like if guard starts detecting you, their vision cone will fill up with a yellow thing, and once that yellow part reaches you, they actually detect you. And that is because we like for people to not have to load all the time or not fail that quickly. Like because you might slip up, you misclick, you make a small mistake, and we want you to be able to fix that and not fail because of that. And it again makes the game feel less rigid. So in a normal difficulty settings and the normally intended way to play these games, we try to give you as much leeway as that as we feel we can, and it's gotten more and more with each game because we realize more that we can do more here, and we always want to be careful not to make it too easy and lose what makes the game fun. So we're moving slowly with these kinds of things, but that's usually the intended way, and then we have the difficulties where you can ramp that up if it's your cup of tea to play in a way that is more punishing in that regard. And I think that this is what most stealth games move into the direction of being less binary and having more of a range where you get detected. Sorry.
All right. I'm trying to think there's anything else. Pony asked a few more questions, but I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to ask for right now. You mentioned earlier with Desperados that you had kind of like the Baron mode with like unique challenges and things that are kind of like off the normal gameplay. Is that anything that you're going to be including in Shadow Gambit?
There is not something like the Baron's challenges, but there is. Since the game is structured very differently, the way badges work also is very differently. It works very differently. So we have a lot of badges. Like in Shadow Tactics or Desperados, you had like 10 to 13, I think, per mission, and we had like 12 to 13 missions. One huge change we're also making in Shadow Gambit is that we're changing mission length. We made missions a lot shorter because we want you to be able to come home from work, play one mission of Shadow Gambit, and have a fun experience and be like, I did something. When you played Shadow Tactics, you would come home and you play 20 minutes, you did like half a setup or something.
Yeah.
Which has its own benefit. Like that's cool, but we wanted to change that part, right? We have both as well in Shadow Gambit, but we wanted to change it up a little bit. So lost track there. I think we're talking about the Baron's challenges and the badges. And since the missions are shorter and you have these locations that you visit multiple times and you have characters that you choose and stuff like that, the whole system of how badges work is different because you don't complete a mission in the game and then it is on a mission selection screen where you can select it again instantly like in the old games. It's more of a linear thing, not linear, but a more like a cohesive campaign story where you go through it. You go on missions, you come back to your pirate ship, you do some stuff on it, you get back to the next mission, and it's a more free from it. You cannot replay those missions until the end game when you've completed the campaign, and then you can replay everything and start hunting these badges more. You can get them before, but that's when you start hunting them. And so we have badges that are tied to characters. We have character badges. Every character has a set of badges that's tied to doing stuff with them. We have characters tied to missions, badges tied to missions, badges tied to locations, general badges. It's a very different system, and there's about 500 badges in the game, and so there's a lot of them. And the idea for you do that is you go into these missions and sort of after you've completed the game, and you just pick a set of stuff that you want to do, and you're like, I want to do this with Pinkos, the character, and I want to do this with that character, I want to do this challenge and that challenge, and you just play a mission and you complete the set of challenges that you picked for yourself that you want to combine there. So it has a rather different approach to it. So it's not directly balance challenges, but there is a lot of stuff in the end game of these micro challenges that you can stack on top of each other and have a unique experience.
All right. Let me see if there's anything else. Talk about the gameplay, we talk about detection, more of the freeform nature. I guess in that respect, as you said, like with trying to balance between being more approachable while still having that like the bite for people who want to play it. For like that audience, or the people who did master Shadow Tactics and Desperados, are there any new or different things you're doing like at like the master or super high difficulty level?
So we are doing it like sort of similar with the old games where you have the Desperado difficulty in Desperados, and I think it was called Shadow. Oh wait, I don't even know if we had it in Shadow Tactics. You wanted to do it, but I think we had to cut it. I don't remember. But so the detection gets also one thing I need to mention. You can customize each of these factors. Like you don't have to choose a set and go with that. You can do that, but you can be, I want to have this on hardcore difficulty. I want to have this aspect on easy. I want to have this aspect on medium, as we had in our games previously. So you can customize it. But if you choose the pure hardcore option, there's going to be almost instant detections. There's times like you have sort of a guard mode time when you get hit, like you don't take any more damage, because if 5 guards are shooting at the same time and you instantly die, that's not fun. This is greatly reduced. So if that happens to you in the hardcore mode, I think it's called Cursed. The difficulty is Cursed. If you do that in Cursed, you're going to die. You have a lot less hit points. Like characters have 4 hit points in normal, and they have 2 in Cursed. You have even less ammo, maybe. I'm not sure if you can put that in there. Like you have 1 ammo. We put the ammo a lot down because it's not about shooting as much as a Western game, but we are thinking about having to start with 0 ammo. And you have to gather the ammo from the mission if you want to shoot your guns on Cursed. So there's a lot of stuff like that. And I mentioned previously quickly that we have this feature where you can revive your characters if they die. And I mentioned that there's a timer involved. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit to give context for the hard mode as well. The way this works is what we don't want people to do, of course, is just run in there, have their character die, kill a guard, wait until the alarm is over, revive the character, run in there, and just have this miserable, grindy experience of misery. So we came up with this timer, and once the timer runs down, the character is dead for good. The mission still doesn't end. You can complete it with less than 3 characters. Usually it's 3 characters. You can just have to carry the dead body out. If all of them are dead, you're done. But yeah. And if this timer, the more often this happens, the more often a character dies, the timer goes down more quickly. So at some point, you're just gonna not be able to abuse it anymore. And these timers are also adjusted, of course, in the hard difficulty, so you cannot, like, it's less forgiving, basically. And this is where we adjust the enemy setups on hard. That is something we did in Desperados as well. So we change enemy types, we add additional enemies in, so the setup becomes more. And this is one of the most important parts, actually, if you're someone who's into these types of games, who's good at these games in Shadow Gambit, don't go for the hardest difficulty. I mean, people will go for the one that is 4 difficulties, go for the hard one, and use these enemy setups because they're going to be tailored to what you want to do as someone who knows the game. And if you're newer to the genre, you go to the basic one.
Mm-hmm. And what you said about only having like a party limit of 3, that was, I think, one of the other things that we kind of saw with some of the older games. I know with Shadow Tactics, that for some of these games, like they escalate to have, the entire party like on the map, and then becomes, I think, a little bit less manageable for some players when you're trying to manage. Okay, I have 7 different guys with completely different powers, and my brain can only comprehend like 2 characters at a time. Yeah. How am I supposed to figure this out?
Yeah, that is like people want missions where you have many characters, and we have those in the game, but you need to go for a baseline. And we had 5 characters before in the games, and we figured out that 3 is the sweet spot. Like if you have 2, that's cool, and you can do some fun stuff with it. Mm-hmm. If you have 3, a lot of cool combinations are possible, and the sandbox really expands a lot. Once you have to start to get to 4 characters, there's usually 1 character people don't use. Like and it's different for everyone. Like you don't like one of them much, that's cool, but it gets, as you said, it's too much to process. Like and you don't need the 4 usually, right? I mean, you can just do it with a 3, which is also good, but it gets weird. So when we have 4-player missions in the older games, we used to do splits usually of 2 and 2. So you start up with 2 on 2 sides of the map, and you have these cool 2-player experiences, and then it combines into 4. And then you have the big last mission in the old games where you have all the characters usually, and it gets a little chaotic, but that's fun still, right? I mean, if it's not the base experience. So we decided that 3 is the sweet spot that we want to go for. It's one that we can control well enough regarding the skill balance, and it's one that players can actually process well throughout the game. There is missions where you play less characters. You can actually pick less characters for every mission. Like, it's a challenge you can impose on yourself. You can be, I want to play this with 1, or sometimes you need to with 2 characters instead of 3. You can do that. You can solo it with someone. And then there is gonna be missions where we let you take more characters, of course, for the story at some point.
Okay. And one thing before I forget, with the planning mode, as you said over the course of our discussion, like the idea of using the planning mode has certainly changed from Shadow Tactics being entirely real time, Desperados allowing you to pause a game. Any other like iterations or changes from Desperados to Shadow Gambit in terms of like the planning feature?
I have to think. Not really. We've done some, like, there's quality of life stuff we've done, but it's like people are probably not gonna, like, they will notice if they play the older games afterwards. But we didn't change how it works at its core because we think it's a feature that's a lot of fun and it works well. We did a lot of under the hood stuff where we with enemy AI, how it reacts and stuff like that to make it feel better and to make it so that it works more often, hopefully, and you don't have to be as meticulous in setting up the timings. But we'll see if this kind of stuff is more stealthy stuff that you do under the hood, and people don't realize it when they play. It's just more what they expect it to be when they play. So we did a lot on that part, but we didn't change any core features into it or something. It still has the same stuff in it. There's one thing that we did, and that is a huge part for Shadow Gambit from a narrative standpoint. I think we incorporated all of these features into the narrative and story of the game. And Shadow Gambit and also the quick load and the quick save is not in the story. It's something you do as a player, and it's fourth wall breaking. And there's people who lose immersion because of that. And I totally get that. Like, I'm safe scumming. I feel bad. I'm not doing what you're supposed to do. But you are in our game, I think that's what we want you to do. So we also, one of the big reasons when we went with Magic was that we wanted to put that into the world. So when you do that, it's actually a pirate ship, the Marley, who's doing who's creating a memory, and it's reloading that, not loading, it's basically recreating that memory. You will get the lore in the game. And that adds a lot of cool stuff. It makes it feel more coherent, it makes it feel less gamey, and it also gives a small narrative the ability to actually play with that a little bit and have stuff like, if you're playing a setup and you're like unleashing a memory for the 8th time because you failed 8 times, your characters, they actually do remember that. Like, the enemies don't, but your player characters, they remember that, and they are going to comment on that. So they can be like, man, this is really tough, and they're aligned with you, right? I mean, you're as a player, man, this is really fucking tough. And then your guy is going to say, man, this is really tough. And you're like, yeah, I feel you. So that's pretty cool. And I like that part about it as well. And that the planning mode also is something the Marley can do.
All right. Yeah, and it's always fun when there's an in-game explanation for using these powers or abilities, and it's something that we're seeing more developers really take use of. I think a really good example that would be stuff like Hades from Supergiant, where wrapping the actual plot around the fact that it is in fact a roguelike, so you are meant to die and replay and do all that.
That's Hades is great. I love Hades.
Let's see, a question from Pony from earlier. They want to know, have you played Mark of the Ninja, and what did you think of it if you did?
Yeah, of course. As a stealth fan, you have to have played I think the game. I like it a lot. I think it has very clever takes on making stealth work in a side-scrolling perspective, which is pretty tough to do, I think, because there's not much space you can operate in, and that is really tough, and they did a great job on that. It looks cool. It plays well. I really like Mark of the Ninja.
Yeah. And as you said, like with like the difference between like side scrolling versus 3D versus isometric, they all really lend themselves very differently to how you have to design stealth. And
Yeah.
actually, that takes me to I think maybe one of my final questions for you for tonight. In terms of level design or environmental design, how does building the environment, or like how do you approach building the environment in a stealth game versus, say, again, like when we look at stuff that's more of a systemic, more action focused, like in a game like in Doom, level design is built around massive arenas or corridors where you have to funnel enemies and kill them. In a stealth game, you have to. It kind of feels like you have to have a very broader approach. That you can't just design, okay, there's just one corridor and this is all you can go to in this level. So, with kind of like going from Shadow Tech to Shadow Gambit, like, how has like environmental and level design have changed, or has it changed in your approach?
That has actually changed a lot because of the island thing and us not being able to predict where you're coming from, and you can move around the whole island and be like, I want to do this, and I want to tackle this setup from north, south, east, whatever. So that changed it a lot on how we need to approach the space, how we need to think about the space. But I think the core like difference, for example, to a game that is, well, I've never made a shooter, so I don't know much about actually building these arenas. But I mean, you see the things, and you there are similarities on a principle level, basically. So you get that. And something that and that's also true for shooters, of course, but something that we try to go for is we call it an identity of an enemy setup. And there's a sort of every like enemy setup you meet in the game has an identity. I mean, it's memorable in a certain way. You play it and you feel like this is the special part about it. And that's the same for combat arenas in a shooter, right? You don't want it to feel the same, so you need to create a pacing. You want to make one that's more about jumping. You want to make one where there's more flying enemies. You want to make, these sorts of things. And this is how we approach it as well. And that also has a huge impact on the environment art and the environment and how it's designed. It's a lot about creating spaces that are differently, that are interesting to navigate, that are fun to look at, where you can put guards in places that are just like, okay, there's a tower. There's a guard on the tower, of course. So he's in an elevated position. I want to get up there, take that guy out first. Make your plans, like have these, it's a walled off maybe base, and then there's a crack in the wall at the back, so you turn your camera and you find the crack and you can sneak in through the back, and you have all these types of things that you put in there. But what you usually start off is with creating a space that looks like it could be a real space, like it makes sense in the world, because that is very important to the way, especially with the top-down perspective. Like if you're in a third person, you can, I think, maybe that's not true anymore, but you could, at least back then, it was a little more abstract because you cannot really see it all. Like the way these things align, you don't know. Like you're going up a corridor, you don't know if that's 5 meters above the ground or 3 until you actually see the ground again. So you can do stuff there that is a little different. You can't do that in a top-down game. You see everything. So it's more like a diorama. It's like a miniature world. And so we take that approach. We want to make it feel real. You want to, this area is here, it's connected to that area. And this way, it looks cool in that way, and then the gameplay works in it. And a lot of it has to then change and evolve based on the gameplay that we put in there. So, yeah, it's a rather huge topic. So I think I could talk about it for a long time. It's a very stressful and hard process to get these locations to where they need to be, because it's just very meticulous detail work on all evolved departments: audio, visuals, gameplay. So,
All right. So I think with that, I am just about out of questions. Before we kind of go into our wrap up, anything else regarding Shadow Gambit from a design, production, any kind of standpoint that we didn't discuss that you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I think there is something that we didn't really talk about much, and I just want to say once, is that you do not only have the choice on what characters to revive and what characters to bring, you also have a choice between missions. So the game has these, it's not like a complete open world thing where you can do whatever you want, but it is like you reach certain points in the game, and then the game opens up, and there are like 5 islands maybe, and you can choose what island you want to go to in what order you want to go to. You usually will visit all of them in the end, but you can start here, you can start there, you can do this one twice, and then do that one. So that is something as well that was rather challenging to do in it because of the difficulty curve and all that type of stuff. But there is choice in that as well. So there's just a lot of sandboxiness and choice in every layer of the game, as I said before, and that includes the choice of the mission that you actually want to play.
And I'm assuming, like, for like each like chunk of the story, you have to do like all the missions in that respective chunk to then move on to like the next section of the game.
Not always. There's a part in the game where that's the case, and then there's a part in the game where you don't have to complete all of them. You just complete a set of them,
Okay.
and the rest you can complete afterwards. Of course, they're not lost. You can, if you reach the end game part, you can say, "I want to now play this part I didn't play before."
Cool. I guess as a kind of like another like kind of general design question just pops in my head.
Mhm.
One thing that we see in sometimes in stealth games is having like the idea of a stealth boss fight or like a boss class enemy in a stealth game, and sometimes he's taken the form of just being like a very puzzle kind of situation. And I just want to ask you, like speaking with like the enemy designs you mentioned earlier with Shadow Gambit, do you have like any like I guess elevated threats or is like a unique threat? Or is that like something that you haven't really like thought about like with like the approach yet?
Mm. So we do have, of course, high points in the game. But as you said, like making actual boss fights in stealth games is extremely hard because you don't really fight. And that's why it usually turns into puzzles or a weird shooter fight where everybody's like, what the fuck was this? Like, I want to stealth. So I think we have rather interesting ideas in the earlier games, like with Shadow Tag. Well, I'm not going to spoil it. So with Shadow Tag, we had one approach. With Desperados 3, we had a more puzzly approach where we created a cool situation that required all the characters to be used in a way. And this is sort of something that we like about it. And we have something new for Shadow Gambit. I'm not going to spoil it, of course, but it is a hard, tough nut to crack. And so it's something that it sort of pays into that identity thing I mentioned. Like you can try to create a very strong identity of a setup around that specific character in a way, and maybe give them one or two sort of abilities or things that they can do or that makes them special and unique. And then it feels like a stealth boss fight, I think. But it is never going to be as cool, I think, as a Doom boss fight or something, or a Zelda boss fight, where you really have these, or Souls games or whatever, but you have these actual combat-centric or puzzle-centric encounters that are just extremely high production value and cool. That is something that is not at the core of our games. So we have it, but we don't have it as much as maybe other games.
All right. Anything else regarding Shadow Gambit before we wrap things up?
No, I think we touched on quite a few things, and like this is a more like a designy thing, right? So we talked about some of the design aspects of it, and I think I would just urge people to try it out because I think it's gonna be pretty cool. And oh yeah, something that I need to mention, of course, is wishlist the game. Like if you're in any way interested in it, even if you're not gonna buy it at launch, if you wishlist it, that helps extremely. Like, we're not a huge developer, and this wishlists help the game being shown on Steam and popping up in the algorithms there. And it's extremely important to do it. It costs you nothing. You can just click it. So go to Steam or whatever platform of your choice. You can go to consoles as well. Try to wishlist the game. That helps us a ton. Take a look at it, and if you like it, we usually have a demo at some point, so you can actually, we had that for the old games as well, so you can try it out and see if you enjoy it for buying it, and then you can buy it, maybe.
All right. It does sound like you're trying to make things a lot more approachable with this one, so I do wish you guys the best of luck, and it does sound like an interesting game. I played both Shadow Tactics and Desperados, but I did kind of bounce off. I did get a little too hard for me, so definitely interested to see how things go with Shadow Gambit.
Thanks. Yeah, will be interesting to hear your opinion about it, because that's something we've been trying to improve a lot on, is make it more approachable for more people and still have it work the same way for the old people.
Do you have, like, for people watching this, do you have an estimated release date, or is that still, to be announced at this point?
It's this year. That's all I can say. Yeah.
And will it be just on PC, or will it be going to other platforms?
No, it's going to be on PC, PS5, Xbox, the new one and the new small. I don't know the names. I think it's 1 and 1S. I don't know the big
like
one
that.
and the small one. All of the new Xboxes, and we are also looking. I think it's going to be an app. I don't know, like some of these stores as well, but that's something that's being checked out at the moment. So yeah, consoles and PC basically.
I guess that kind of brings up like one like super final question. Like, how is it designing like a game like this for the console? Because again, keyboard, mouse, and gamepad are two very functionally different peripherals.
Yeah, I mean, this is something strategy games have been struggling with a lot, right? It's I think also maybe one of the reasons why the genre sort of died out at some point. So we did that with Shadow Tactics already. Like we knew that we wanted to make it work with gamepads. And there actually was Commandos 2 actually came out for PS2, I think. And at this time there was no knowledge on how to do strategy games well on consoles. So it had a lot of things that didn't work out well. But they did one thing that made us confident in that we can do it, and that was giving you direct control over the character with a stick of the gamepad. So you're not being in that commander role where you're standing around, but you're running around. And that it makes the game feel very differently, and I personally love how that feels. Like, it makes it a lot more immersive. Of course, it is a little harder to execute certain things, but it's not like if you're used to the gamepad, it works totally fine and you can do anything in the game. You might just be more efficient with the mouse keyboard and doing certain moves where you send 3 characters at the same time because you can just order them like a command on RTS. But it's so you have these 2 principles of how the game feels, and then you design everything so it works with both. That's how we approach it. So we do nothing. Whenever we make a new skill, we make a new character, we always look at it and be like, can we do this on gamepad and mouse keyboard? Will it feel good on both? And if no, we're going to redesign it and do something different. So we never run into the problem of having stuff that we designed for mouse keyboard only, and then we want to do a gamepad version and we're like, oh god, this is going to be terrible. So it's baked into everything from the beginning, and I think that's how you need to do it. And I think it works pretty well. Like, we've received great feedback for gamepad for the previous games as well, and at this one even better feedback because we did some very cool changes to how the camera works. I think that people are going to enjoy a lot. It's more intuitive. The camera just follows you all the time now instead of you having to move it around. So yeah, gamepad is a challenge, but it's one we've been doing for a couple of years, and we're good at it, I think.
Great. I just have some like painful memories of trying to play like old like strategy games using a gamepad and trying to move the pointer with an analog stick or a control pad.
Yeah, like there was, I think, StarCraft on PS1 or 2 or something, or Warcraft 3 or Warcraft 2, I think was on PS1 or 2. That was that was not fun. No. Especially if you were used to it playing on a PC and you were like, yeah, click, 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 I'm fast.
Yeah. All right, so I think with that, to wrap things up, so first off, do you have any social media? I'll include links to, of course, the game page in the description for the record version, but anything you want to mention in terms of social media, sites, whatever, definitely feel free.
Yeah, so you can go to shadowgambit.com and check out the trailers for the game. You can go, I think, there, and on other parts, there is also a newsletter you can subscribe to. And we do not spam you with stuff. It's really just important stuff about our games. Like, we send these out not that regularly, and it's usually with cool information in it. So that's something you can do. You can check us on Twitter at MimimiProd. Like, we used to be called Mimimi Productions. That's why it's at MimimiProd, but that changed. And yeah, shadowgambit.com, Facebook pages, Instagram, everything. They're like the companies on all of those. So choose the channel of your liking, and you will get information about the games that we make.
Great. So then my final question for you for tonight is, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans watching, anything to kind of take us out with?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for enjoying our games and sticking with us and playing them. And I'm really looking forward what everybody says about Shadow Gambit. I'm very excited for it. It has a lot of cool stuff in it, and it's for me, it's a ton of fun to play. And I can't wait to get the feedback from everybody involved and wishlist it and have fun once it comes out.
Great. This has been a really fantastic chat, Moritz. I really enjoy, again, like talking about design and like being able to have this conversation about stealth. Like, there's so much more I want to talk with you about, but we'll be here for like a few more hours for sure.
Yeah, I guess we could sit here for a couple of hours still.
If you are free in the future, I'd love to have you back on, especially like around after Shadow Gambit is released, and we can certainly talk more about stealth for sure.
Yeah, totally. Just hit us up. I enjoy these kinds of podcasts and discussions a lot, so I do them just because I like to talk about design.
Me too. Let's see. All right, so thank you, Pony, for that. So we're going to wrap things up for this week's episode of the Perceptive Podcast. Again, you'll find links to all Mimimi stuff down below. Wishlist Shadow Gambit. Check out their other games as well. If you're new, do the YouTube stuff. Bell ring, subscribe, like, and all that. Be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon as well. Check out my game design books. And if you are a developer who would like to come on to either talk about a game they're working on or just talk about game design, reach out. I'm always looking for guests for these live and recorded shows. Again, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you it's my afternoon, your evening, so I will let you have a nice, relaxed evening. But yeah, again, if you are free in the future, we can certainly chat some more.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and bye, everyone.
All right. So with that said, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where you send the art and science of games. Until our next show, have a great night.